There's a structure that almost every person on Earth recognizes. It does not need an introduction. It does not need a label. The moment most people see its silhouette, the raised arm, the torch, the crown, the long-robed figure standing at the edge of the water, they know exactly what they are looking at. It has appeared in photographs, in films, in history books, and on currency. It has been referenced in political speeches and used as a backdrop for some of the most significant moments in modern history. For well over a century, it has occupied a very specific place in the global imagination, and that place has always been associated with one idea above all others: freedom. The story most people know is simple and familiar. A group of French intellectuals, inspired by the ideals of democracy and the end of the American Civil War, proposed the idea of a monument, a gift from one nation to another, a physical expression of shared values, of liberty, of the kind of political vision that both countries believed they represented to the world. The statue was designed, built, shipped across the Atlantic in pieces, assembled on a small island in New York Harbor, and unveiled to great celebration in 1886. That is the version of events that has been repeated for generations. And for most people, that is where the story ends. But here's where it starts to get interesting. Because when you begin to look at this story not from a distance, not from the comfortable position of someone simply admiring the monument, but from up close, with careful attention to the specific details, the people involved, the timing, and the decisions that were made along the way, something shifts. The story does not fall apart. It does not suddenly reveal itself to be false, but it becomes less clean, less simple. Certain parts of the official explanation begin to feel like they are missing something. And once that feeling arrives, it is difficult to ignore. Consider the most basic question first. Why this symbol? Of all the ways a nation could express the idea of freedom, why a robed female figure holding a torch? That choice was not obvious. It was not the result of a public vote or a broad cultural discussion. It came from a specific group of people with specific intellectual backgrounds who had specific ideas about what freedom meant and how it should be represented. That group made a decision, and that decision became a monument that now represents an entire nation to the entire world. Most people have never stopped to ask who those people were, what they believed, or whether their private understanding of the symbol matched the public explanation that was later attached to it. Then there is the question of placement. The statue stands at the entrance to New York Harbor. That location is now so associated with the monument that it feels inevitable, as if there could never have been any other option. But the choice of that specific location, on that specific island, facing that specific direction, was the result of deliberate decisions made by specific individuals. Those decisions have their own history, and that history raises questions that the official story does not fully address. The timing is also worth examining. The idea for the statue was proposed in 1865, the year the Civil War ended, the year slavery was formally abolished in the United States. That connection seems meaningful. It suggests the statue was tied to a specific moment of transformation in American history. But the statue did not arrive until 1886, 21 years later. A great deal changed in those 2 decades. The political climate shifted. The progress made after the Civil War began to erode in significant ways. By the time the statue was actually dedicated, the conditions that had originally inspired the proposal looked very different. And yet, the official narrative has rarely engaged seriously with that gap. The statue is still described as a monument to freedom, without much attention to the question of what freedom actually looked like in America at the moment of its arrival. At first, this seems like a minor issue, a matter of timing, of historical context, of the natural delays that come with a large and complicated project. But there is a problem. When a symbol is built to represent a specific idea, and the conditions surrounding that idea change dramatically between the moment it is proposed and the moment it is unveiled, that creates a tension. And that tension deserves acknowledgement. The official story does not fully provide it. Most people, when they encounter the Statue of Liberty, whether in person, in photographs, or in historical accounts, accept the explanation they were given. It is a gift from France. It is a symbol of freedom. It welcomes those who arrive by sea. These explanations are not wrong. They are part of the story, but they may not be the complete story. And the difference between a partial story and a complete one is precisely where the questions begin to gather. There is a particular kind of research that focuses not on what official histories say, but on what they leave out, what is not mentioned, what is glossed over, what is described in one sentence when perhaps it deserves several pages. This kind of research is sometimes dismissed as speculation, but at its most careful and disciplined, it simply asks the question that any thorough investigator would ask: is the information I have been given sufficient to fully explain what I am looking at? In the case of the Statue of Liberty, a growing number of historians, researchers, and independent investigators have concluded that the answer is no. Their questions are not about the physical statue itself. They are not challenging the engineering, the artistry, or the craft involved in its creation. What they are examining is the layer beneath the surface, the motivations, the networks, the symbolic choices, the financial arrangements, and the political context that surrounded the statue's creation and arrival. These are things that exist in historical records. They are documented, but they are rarely placed front and center when the statue's story is told. This raises questions, not accusations, questions. There is an important difference. An accusation claims to know the answer. A question acknowledges that the answer is not yet clear, and that is precisely the position that careful investigation requires. Not certainty, not conclusion, but a willingness to sit with the fact that something does not fully add up, and to keep looking. What was this symbol actually meant to represent? Not according to the speeches given at its dedication, but according to the people who designed it, funded it, and made the decisions that brought it into existence. Were their intentions fully captured by the public explanation that was offered? Or was there a private layer of meaning that never made it into the official story? These are not new questions. They have been asked before by people with serious academic and investigative credentials, and they have not been fully answered. It is also worth considering how deeply this symbol has shaped the way an entire nation is understood, both by itself and by the rest of the world. The Statue of Liberty does not simply stand on an island. It functions as a kind of statement. It tells a story about what America is, what it values, and what it offers. That story has been repeated so many times, in so many contexts, that it has become almost impossible to question. And that, in itself, is worth paying attention to. When a symbol becomes too familiar to examine, it becomes something other than a symbol. It becomes an assumption. And assumptions, more than almost anything else, are where the most important questions tend to hide. The structure still stands. The torch still rises above the harbor, and the official explanation is still the one most people carry with them. But underneath that explanation, in the details of who was involved, in the timing of events, in the specific choices that were made and the ones that were not, there's a set of questions that has never been fully resolved. Some researchers have spent years trying to answer them. Others have concluded that the answers, if they exist, are not meant to be found easily. And that, perhaps, is the most curious thing of all. Not the monument itself, but the way its story has been told, what has been included, what has been left out, and what continues to remain just slightly out of reach, no matter how closely you look. This raises questions, and those questions, as it turns out, do not have easy answers. The official explanation for the Statue of Liberty is one of the most well-known stories in modern history. It is taught in schools, repeated in museums, and printed in countless books and official documents. On the surface, it is a straightforward account, a gift between two nations, built on shared ideals, delivered as a gesture of friendship and mutual respect. Most people encounter this explanation early in life and carry it with them without much reason to question it. And in many ways, that is entirely understandable. The story is clean, the facts are presented with confidence, and the monument itself stands as visible, undeniable proof that something significant was built and given. The story begins with a man named Edouard de Laboulaye. He was a French political thinker, a legal scholar, and a deep admirer of the American political system. In 1865, at a dinner gathering in France, he reportedly proposed the idea of creating a monument to be given to the United States, something that would honor the end of the Civil War and celebrate the democratic values that France and America supposedly shared. That dinner, that conversation, that single proposal, this is the official starting point of the entire project, a moment that would eventually result in one of the most recognized structures ever built. Laballé's idea found support among a circle of like-minded French intellectuals and political figures. From that group, the project gradually took shape. A sculptor was needed, someone with both the skill and the vision to translate an abstract idea into a physical monument of enormous scale. The man chosen was Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi. He was already an established sculptor with experience in large-scale work, and he embraced the project with considerable energy. Bartholdi would go on to become the primary creative force behind the statue's design, making decisions about its form, its symbolism, and its overall character. What is worth noting here is that the selection of Bartholdi was not the result of a formal public process. It was an internal decision made within a private circle. The question of why he was chosen, and not someone else, is not something the official history spends much time addressing. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the person who designs a symbol has significant influence over what that symbol actually means. And Bartholdi's background and beliefs were not without their own particular character, something that becomes more relevant as the story continues to unfold. The structural engineering of the statue was handled by Gustave Eiffel, a name that carries its own considerable weight in history. Eiffel is primarily known for the tower in Paris that bears his name, but his involvement in the Statue of Liberty predates that project. He was responsible for designing the internal iron framework that allows the copper exterior to hold its shape and withstand wind, weight, and the passage of time. His contribution was largely technical, but it was essential. Without that internal structure, the statue could not stand. The official record credits him appropriately, and this part of the story is not disputed. The statue was constructed in France over a period of several years. It was built in sections, with different parts of the copper figure taking shape in Bartholdi's workshop in Paris. There are historical photographs of the process, the hand and torch completed and displayed before the rest of the statue was finished, the head exhibited at a World's Fair. The construction was a long, complex, and expensive undertaking, and when it was finally complete, the entire statue was disassembled, packed into more than 200 wooden crates, and loaded onto a French naval vessel for the journey across the Atlantic. It arrived in the United States in 1885, but this is where the timeline becomes slightly complicated. The statue had arrived, but the pedestal it was meant to stand on was not yet finished. The fundraising effort on the American side had stalled. There was not enough money. The pedestal sat incomplete for a period, and the statue's pieces remained in storage while the financial situation was resolved. That delay, and the difficulty of raising the necessary funds, is a detail that the standard telling of the story tends to move past fairly quickly. But it raises a question. If this was truly a monument of shared national pride, why was it so difficult to secure public enthusiasm and funding for something as basic as the foundation it would stand on? The funding gap was eventually addressed through a campaign led by Joseph Pulitzer, the newspaper publisher, who used his platform to encourage ordinary Americans to donate. The campaign worked, and the pedestal was completed. On October 28, 1886, the statue was officially dedicated in a ceremony attended by President Grover Cleveland and a large crowd. Speeches were made. The official story was formally established on that day. A gift, a symbol, a shared achievement. And from that moment forward, the narrative largely solidified. The symbolism of the statue, as explained in official accounts, is deliberate and layered. The torch represents enlightenment, the idea of light cutting through darkness, of knowledge and progress guiding the way forward. The crown with its 7 rays is said to represent the 7 seas and the 7 continents, suggesting a universal reach. The tablet held in the statue's left hand is inscribed with the date of American independence, July 4, 1776, connecting the monument directly to the founding of the nation. And at the statue's feet, largely hidden from most viewing angles, are broken chains. These chains, according to the official explanation, represent the end of slavery and the liberation of those who were once held in bondage. Each of these elements has a clean and stated meaning. Each one fits neatly into the overall narrative of liberty and freedom. But this is where it becomes unclear, because symbols do not always mean only one thing. And the people who choose symbols, particularly people with specific philosophical or intellectual backgrounds, often embed layers of meaning that are not fully captured in the public explanation. The official interpretation of the statue's symbols is the one most widely known. It may not be the only interpretation that was intended. The official story also presents the relationship between France and America as the central reason for the statue's creation. Two nations, sharing democratic ideals, honoring their friendship through a grand gesture. That framing is simple and appealing, but it leaves out a significant amount of context about what was actually happening in both countries at the time. France in the 1860s was not a stable democracy. It was under the rule of Napoleon III, and many French Republicans, including Rabelais, were deeply frustrated with the political situation at home. The admiration for American democracy, in this context, was not simply an intellectual preference. It was a political statement, and that changes the character of the gesture somewhat. If the statue was partly a message from French Republicans to their own government, a way of holding up American democracy as a model that France should follow, then it was not purely a gift to America. It was also a tool in an internal French political debate. That does not make the official story false, but it does suggest that the motivations behind the project were more complex than a simple act of international friendship, and that complexity is rarely foregrounded in the standard account. At first, it seems normal to present a simplified version of a complicated historical event. That is how most history is taught. Details are condensed, motivations are simplified, and the result is a story that is easy to understand and easy to remember. But there is a problem. When the simplified version becomes the only version, when it is repeated so many times that the more complicated details are effectively forgotten, something important is lost. And in the case of a symbol this powerful, something this embedded in the identity of an entire nation, the loss of those details matters. The official explanation for the Statue of Liberty is not wrong. The facts it presents are largely accurate. Rabelais did propose the idea. Bartholdi did design it. Eiffel did build the structure. It was dedicated in 1886. France did fund the statue. America did fund the pedestal. All of that is true. But truth is not only about what is included. It is also about what is left out. And the official explanation leaves out quite a lot. About the people involved, their backgrounds, their beliefs, their networks, and their private motivations. Those things are documented. They exist in historical records. They are simply not part of the version of the story that most people ever encounter. The document trail surrounding the statue's creation is extensive. Letters, meeting notes, financial records, correspondence between the key figures. These materials exist and have been studied, but they are rarely discussed in popular accounts of the statue's history. Instead, what most people receive is the surface version, the gift, the friendship, the symbol, and for most purposes, that version is sufficient. It answers the basic question of what the statue is and where it came from, but it does not fully answer the question of why. Why this design? Why these symbols? Why these specific people? Why this particular moment in history was chosen to deliver a monument that had been planned for 2 decades? Why certain details have remained quietly in the background while others have been placed at the front of the story? These are the kinds of questions that careful investigation tends to produce. Not dramatic conclusions, not accusations, just a persistent, uncomfortable feeling that the explanation you have been given is accurate as far as it goes, but that it does not go nearly far enough. The official story of the Statue of Liberty is clean and inspiring, and that in itself is something worth examining. Here is the first thing that doesn't fully make sense, and it is not a small detail. It sits at the very center of the statue's stated purpose, the reason it was proposed, the reason it was built, and the reason it was given. Once you see it clearly, it is difficult to move past without asking at least one uncomfortable question. The Statue of Liberty is described, in nearly every official account, as a monument to freedom. Specifically, it is connected to a very particular moment of freedom, the end of the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery. The year 1865 is important here. That was the year the war ended. That was the year the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was passed, formally abolishing slavery across the country. And that was also the year that Edouard de Rabelais first proposed the idea of creating a monument to celebrate this moment and the shared democratic values it represented. The connection between the statue's origin and the end of slavery is not invented. It is part of the historical record. It is cited in serious academic work, and it forms a central part of the meaning that the statue is said to carry. So the foundation of the story seems solid. A terrible chapter in American history came to an end. A French admirer of American democracy proposed a monument to mark that transformation. The idea was to celebrate freedom, real, meaningful, hard-won freedom, and to honor it with something permanent and visible. But here is where the timeline does not fully match the story being told. The statue did not arrive in 1865. It did not arrive in 1870, or 1875, or even 1880. It arrived in 1885 and was dedicated in 1886, 21 years after the moment it was supposedly built to celebrate. 21 years is not a minor delay. It is a full generation. It is enough time for an entire political era to rise and fall. And in the United States, between 1865 and 1886, an enormous amount did rise and fall. The period immediately following the Civil War is known as Reconstruction. It was a complicated, contested, and ultimately short-lived attempt to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American civic and political life. For a brief period, black men voted, held political office, and participated in public life in ways that had never been possible before. It was imperfect, uneven, and deeply resisted in many parts of the country, but it represented a genuine, if fragile, expansion of the freedom that the statue was supposedly built to honor. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively over. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South as part of a political compromise. The protections that had been put in place for formerly enslaved people were systematically removed. And what followed was not a continuation of the freedom that 1865 had promised. What followed was something closer to the opposite. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and other legal mechanisms were introduced specifically to prevent black Americans from voting. Racial segregation began to be formalized and enforced through law. Violence was used openly and routinely to maintain a social order that looked, in many practical ways, very similar to the one that had existed before the war. This was the world that existed when the Statue of Liberty was dedicated in October of 1886. The specific freedom it was built to celebrate, freedom for people who had been enslaved, was being actively and systematically dismantled in real time, in full public view, with very little federal resistance. And yet, the dedication ceremony proceeded as planned. The speeches were given. The torch was unveiled, and not one significant public acknowledgement was made of the contradiction that sat at the heart of the entire event. At first, it seems possible to explain this away. Perhaps the ceremony was focused on ideals rather than present conditions. Perhaps the intention was to point toward a future rather than account for a present. Some historians argue exactly this, that the statue was always meant to represent an aspiration, not a report on current reality. That is a reasonable position. But there is a problem. When a symbol is used to celebrate freedom, and the people whose freedom was the stated reason for that symbol are simultaneously being denied basic rights, the silence around that contradiction is not neutral. It is a choice. And choices, particularly in public ceremonies attended by the President of the United States, are worth examining. The speeches delivered at the dedication focused on the friendship between France and America, on liberty as a philosophical ideal, on the future of democratic civilization. These were not empty words. They reflected genuine beliefs held by the people who spoke them. But the framing was notably abstract. Liberty as a concept, freedom as an aspiration, the specific, material conditions of actual people living in America at that moment, the conditions that made the statue's symbolism most urgently relevant, were not part of the conversation that day. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because it is one thing to say that a monument represents an ideal that has not yet been fully achieved. Many monuments do exactly that, but it is another thing entirely to dedicate a monument to freedom while simultaneously, in the same country, in the same political era, watching the rights of specific people be legally stripped away, and to say nothing about it. The gap between the symbol and the reality it claimed to represent was not subtle in 1886. It was enormous, and it was visible to anyone paying attention. There is another detail from the dedication ceremony that receives very little attention in standard accounts, But that becomes more significant the longer you consider it. When the statue was unveiled on October 28, 1886, women were not permitted to attend the official ceremony on Bedloe's Island. The island was restricted to invited guests, and those invited guests were overwhelmingly men. Women, who made up approximately half of the entire population of the country, were formally excluded from witnessing the dedication of a monument that took the form of a woman and was said to represent liberty for all. A group of suffragists, unwilling to simply accept this exclusion, hired a boat and positioned themselves in the harbor near the island. From that boat, they delivered their own speeches and made their protest visible. They were not on the island. They were not part of the official record of the day. They were present, but separated, close enough to see the ceremony, but excluded from participating in it. That image is worth holding for a moment. A statue representing freedom, in the form of a woman, dedicated in a ceremony from which women were excluded, while a group of women protested from the water nearby. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because it raises a very direct question about the nature of the freedom being celebrated. If the symbol was genuinely meant to represent liberty for all people, as the official explanation consistently claims, then the decision to exclude women from the dedication ceremony requires some kind of explanation, and that explanation has never been fully provided. Some believe the exclusion was simply a reflection of the social norms of the time, that it was not a deliberate statement, but simply the way public events were organized in 1886. Others disagree, arguing that the people responsible for planning the ceremony made active choices about who was invited and who was not, and that those choices reveal something about whose freedom the monument was actually designed to honor. The truth is likely somewhere in the space between these positions, but the fact that the question exists at all, that the dedication of a symbol of universal freedom could proceed in a way that so visibly excluded entire groups of people, is itself a kind of answer. The broken chains at the statue's feet are one of the most symbolically significant elements of the entire monument. They are not prominently visible from most angles. You have to look down, toward the base, to see them clearly. In the official explanation, they represent the end of slavery, the breaking of bondage, the liberation of those who were once held in chains. It is a powerful image, but given the political reality of 1886, given what was actually happening to formerly enslaved people across the South at that exact moment, the placement of those chains, hidden at the base and invisible to most viewers, takes on a different quality. Whether intentional or not, the symbolism of freedom being placed at the bottom and out of sight, while the torch of enlightenment was raised high above for the world to see, is an arrangement that does not fully make sense when placed alongside the statue's stated purpose. What the dedication of the Statue of Liberty actually revealed, when examined carefully, was a very specific idea of freedom, one that was abstract enough to be celebrated publicly, but narrow enough to leave out a significant portion of the people living under it. That is not a fringe interpretation. Historians who have studied this period carefully have noted the disconnect between the statue's symbolism and the lived conditions of people in America at the time of its unveiling. It is a documented gap, not a speculation. The question that remains, and that has never been satisfactorily resolved, is whether that gap was an oversight or a reflection of something more deliberate. Was the statue's celebration of freedom genuinely intended for everyone, with the exclusions being a failure of the era rather than a feature of the design? Or was the freedom being celebrated always understood, by those who created and dedicated the monument, to apply to a specific group of people, and not to others? Both positions have been argued. Neither has been conclusively proven. And that uncertainty, sitting quietly beneath one of the most recognized symbols in the world, is not a small thing. It is the kind of unresolved question that changes the way a symbol functions, not by destroying its meaning, but by complicating it in ways that deserve more attention than they have typically received. This raises questions about who was in the room when the decisions were made, about whose freedom was being celebrated, and whose was being quietly set aside, and about what it means to call something a symbol of liberty when the conditions surrounding its creation tell a more complicated story than the one most people were ever given. To understand the Statue of Liberty more fully, it is not enough to look at the monument itself. The physical structure, the copper, the iron frame, the torch, the crown, tells only part of the story. The more revealing part lies in the people who made it happen, the individuals who proposed it, designed it, championed it, and guided it from an idea discussed at a private dinner into one of the most recognized monuments ever built. When you start looking at those people carefully, their backgrounds, their beliefs, their motivations, and their political circumstances, the story becomes considerably more layered than the official version suggests. The name most associated with the statue's origin is Édouard de Laboulaye. He is typically described in official accounts as a French political thinker and admirer of America who proposed the idea of a gift between nations. That description is accurate, but it is also incomplete in ways that matter. Laboulaye was not simply a man who admired America from a distance. He was a deeply serious legal scholar who spent years studying American political institutions, American constitutional history, and the specific structures that made the American system function. His interest was not casual or cultural. It was intellectual, political, and in many ways personal. To understand why Laboulaye cared so deeply about America, it helps to understand what was happening in France at the time. When he proposed the idea of the statue in 1865, France was under the rule of Napoleon III, a government that Laboulaye and many of his colleagues found deeply objectionable. Napoleon III had come to power through a coup and governed in a way that restricted political freedoms and limited opposition. For French Republicans like Laboulaye, America represented something that France did not yet have: a functioning democratic republic where political power was genuinely distributed and individual rights were protected by law. This is the context in which the proposal for the statue was born, and this context changes its character in a significant way. Some historians have noted that the statue was not simply a gift to America. It was also a political statement directed at France, a way of holding up American democracy as a model, as proof that Republican governance was not only possible but successful. If that reading is correct, then the statue was serving two purposes at once: one public and celebratory, directed outward toward America; one political and pointed, directed inward toward the French political situation. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because a monument built partly to influence domestic French politics is a different kind of object than a simple international gift. The official story does not fully engage with this dual purpose. It presents the statue as a generous act of friendship between two nations. That framing is simpler and more appealing, but it leaves out the political urgency that was driving at least some of the people involved. Laboulaye and his circle were not neutral observers of American democracy. They were activists with a specific agenda, and that agenda shaped the project from its very beginning. Then there is Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, the sculptor who gave the statue its physical form. Bartholdi is presented in official accounts as a talented artist who was selected to bring Laboulaye's vision to life. And again, that description is not wrong, but it does not capture the full picture. Bartholdi was an ambitious man with a particular interest in monumental sculpture, in creating works of enormous scale that would leave a lasting mark on the world. He was drawn to the idea of building something that could not be ignored, something that would stand for centuries and be seen by millions of people. Before he became associated with the Statue of Liberty, Bartholdi had already proposed a project of remarkable similarity. He had designed a figure, a large, robed woman holding a torch aloft, and proposed that it be built at the entrance to the Suez Canal in Egypt. The project was called Egypt Carrying the Light to Asia. The concept was straightforward in its symbolism: a monumental female figure representing light, progress, and the illumination of a new era, positioned at a significant geographical and commercial gateway. That project was rejected. The Egyptian authorities did not accept the proposal, and the design was never built. But here is the part that does not fit neatly into the official story of the Statue of Liberty. The design that Bartholdi had prepared for Egypt, a robed woman with a raised torch, standing at the entrance to a major waterway, bears a striking resemblance to the design he later developed for New York Harbor. The posture, the concept, the symbolic language, they are closely related. This is not a secret. It is documented in art historical research and has been written about by serious scholars. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the official story of the Statue of Liberty presents the design as something created specifically for America, as a symbol carefully crafted to represent American values, American history, and the shared ideals of France and the United States. If the design was originally prepared for Egypt, for a completely different location, a completely different cultural context, and a completely different stated purpose, then that claim becomes harder to sustain. The design was not tailored to America. It was adapted for America, and that is a meaningful distinction. At first, it seems reasonable to argue that a good design can carry meaning in multiple contexts. Artists reuse and adapt ideas all the time. Bartholdi was a professional sculptor working within a specific visual tradition, and it would not be unusual for him to develop a concept and then find different applications for it. Some historians make exactly this argument. They suggest that the similarities between the Egyptian proposal and the American statue are simply the result of a sculptor working with a recurring visual theme, and that the meaning of the final statue should be evaluated on its own terms, not by reference to an earlier rejected project. Others disagree. They argue that the connection between the two designs is significant precisely because it complicates the idea that the statue's symbolism was specifically and deliberately constructed around American values. If the same figure, with the same basic symbolic language, was first proposed for the entrance to the Suez Canal, then the symbolism attached to the American version cannot be as uniquely and precisely tailored as the official explanation implies. The meaning, in this reading, was more general, more about a particular philosophical idea of light and progress, than about anything specific to America or to the end of slavery. Why does this matter? Because the meaning of a symbol is not a minor detail. It is the entire point. The Statue of Liberty derives its power from the belief that it was intentionally and meaningfully constructed to represent something specific, the freedom of a specific people, at a specific moment in history, in a specific place. If the design was a recycled concept, originally prepared for a different country and a different purpose, then the relationship between the symbol and the meaning attached to it becomes less direct, not false, but less precise. And precision matters when the symbol in question has shaped the way an entire nation understands itself. There is also the question of what exactly the torch represents. In the Egyptian proposal, the figure holding the torch was described as carrying light to Asia. The torch was a symbol of illumination, of one civilization bringing knowledge and progress to another. That is a specific kind of symbolism. It is not primarily about political freedom or the end of slavery. It is about the transmission of light and knowledge, a concept with a long history in particular philosophical and intellectual traditions. When Bartholdi adapted the design for America, the official explanation shifted the meaning of the torch toward liberty and enlightenment in a political sense. But the original symbolic context, light is something carried and transmitted by a specific figure to a wider world, did not disappear entirely. It simply went unacknowledged. Some researchers have found this background worth examining more closely, not to discredit the statue, but to better understand the intellectual tradition from which it emerged. The idea of a torch-bearing figure as a symbol of enlightenment has roots that go well beyond American or French Republican politics. It appears in various philosophical and symbolic traditions that were very much alive among educated European intellectuals of the 19th century. Whether those traditions influenced the design of the Statue of Liberty, consciously or unconsciously, is a question that the official story does not address. Laboulaye's political motivations and Bartholdi's recycled design, taken together, paint a picture of the statue's origins that is more complicated than the familiar version. Neither man was simply acting out of uncomplicated generosity or straightforward artistic vision. Both had histories, ambitions, and contexts that shaped what they created and why. Those histories are documented. They exist in letters, in scholarly records, in the historical accounts of people who knew them. They are simply not the part of the story that tends to make it into the standard version. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Not because the official story is dishonest, but because it is selective. It presents the most appealing version of events, the one that produces the cleanest and most inspiring narrative, without fully accounting for the complexity that surrounded the project from its earliest stages. The people who built this monument were real, complicated individuals with real, complicated motivations. Understanding them more fully does not diminish the statue, but it does change the way its story sits. The questions raised by this background do not resolve easily. Why was the same design first proposed for Egypt? What does that say about the specificity of the symbolism that was later attached to it? And what were the full range of intentions held by the people who pushed this project from proposal to completion? These questions remain open. The records exist, but the answers they provide are not the ones the official story has ever been particularly eager to offer. There are details in the historical record surrounding the Statue of Liberty that do not demand immediate attention. They are not the kinds of things that appear in the opening paragraphs of official accounts. They sit quietly in the background, in footnotes, in specialized research, in the kind of material that most people never encounter unless they are actively looking for it. Individually, each one can be explained away without much difficulty, but when they are placed side by side, examined together rather than separately, something begins to take shape. Not a conclusion, but a pattern. And patterns, particularly in the history of deliberate and carefully designed symbols, are worth paying attention to. The first of these details involves the face of the statue itself. This is perhaps the most personal element of the entire monument. A sculptor who creates a human figure makes countless decisions about posture, proportion, expression, and likeness. The face of the Statue of Liberty is not generic. It has specific features. It has a particular expression. It was clearly modeled on something or someone. And yet, after more than a century, there's no confirmed, officially documented answer to the straightforward question of whose face it is. Various accounts have circulated over the years. The most commonly repeated suggestion is that Bartholdi used his mother, Charlotte Bartholdi, as the model for the statue's face. This explanation appears in a number of historical references and has been repeated often enough that many people accept it as settled fact. But Bartholdi himself never made a clear, definitive, documented public statement confirming this. The claim exists largely through secondary sources and retrospective accounts. It is a possibility. It may even be correct, but it has never been formally verified in the way that one might expect for a detail this significant. Other accounts point to different possible influences. Some researchers have suggested the face carries traces of other individuals, people from Bartholdi's personal life or artistic circle. Still others have proposed interpretations rooted in symbolic, rather than personal reference, suggesting the face was constructed to represent an ideal type rather than a specific person. None of these alternatives have been confirmed either. What remains is an absence, a gap where a clear answer should exist. The face of one of the most observed monuments in the world, and the question of whose likeness it carries, remains genuinely unresolved. That detail sounds minor at first. A sculptor's choice of model is a personal and artistic matter, but it is worth remembering that this was not a private commission. This was a monument of enormous public significance, intended to represent the values of an entire nation. The face chosen for it was not incidental. It was a deliberate decision, and the fact that no clear, confirmed account of that decision exists after so many decades of documentation, scholarship, and public interest is the kind of absence that tends to invite questions rather than quiet them. The second detail involves the torch, not the torch as a symbol, but the specific physical torch that the statue carried from its dedication in 1886 until 1984. For nearly a century, that original torch was the one visitors and observers looked up at when they looked at the Statue of Liberty. It was part of the monument. It was the element most directly associated with the statue's central symbolism, the idea of liberty holding light above the world. And then, in 1984, it was removed and replaced. The official explanation is practical and straightforward. The original torch had suffered significant deterioration over the decades. Water had penetrated the copper, causing damage that made restoration difficult and further deterioration likely. A new torch was created, redesigned and covered in gold leaf to better reflect light. The replacement was presented as a matter of preservation, of protecting the monument's integrity for future generations. That explanation is reasonable on its surface. Restoration and replacement of deteriorating elements is a normal part of maintaining historical structures. But this is where it becomes unclear. The original torch, an object that had stood as a national symbol for nearly 100 years, that had been photographed millions of times, that had been the subject of poems and speeches and political statements, was removed and placed in the Monuments Museum lobby. There was no major national conversation about this decision beforehand. There was no broad public debate about whether to preserve the original or replace it. A significant physical piece of an iconic national symbol was quietly retired and replaced, and the process did not generate the kind of attention one might expect given the object's cultural weight. Some believe this was simply an administrative and conservation decision, handled by the relevant authorities in the way such decisions typically are. Others have noted that the absence of public discussion around the replacement of something so symbolically significant is itself worth remarking on, not because the decision was necessarily wrong, but because the silence around it stands in contrast to the enormous public meaning that the torch was always said to carry. If the torch truly represents liberty and enlightenment for millions of people, then its replacement might reasonably have been treated as a matter of wider public interest. The fact that it largely was not raises a quiet but persistent question about how decisions regarding this symbol are actually made, and by whom. The third detail involves the crown, specifically the 7 rays that extend outward from the statue's head. The official explanation for these rays is that they represent the 7 seas and the 7 continents. It is a clean and universal interpretation. 7 rays for 7 seas, 7 rays for 7 continents. The statue's light reaching outward in all directions, to every part of the world. That explanation is the one taught in schools, repeated in guidebooks, and offered on official informational materials at the monument itself. At first, it seems like a complete and satisfying answer. But there is a problem. The number 7 does not only carry geographical meaning, it carries deep significance in a wide range of philosophical, religious, and symbolic traditions that were very much active and influential among educated European intellectuals in the 19th century, precisely the period during which the statue was conceived and designed. In various traditions, the number 7 is associated with cosmic order, spiritual completeness, and the structure of hidden knowledge. It appears in ancient symbolic systems, in philosophical frameworks, and in the particular intellectual traditions that were practiced by several of the individuals closely involved with the statue's creation. This does not mean the official explanation is wrong. The 7 seas and 7 continents interpretation may have been exactly what Bartholdi intended, or at least exactly what he stated publicly. But it is also true that symbols can carry more than one layer of meaning simultaneously. A creator working within a particular intellectual tradition might choose a number that satisfies both a public explanation and a private one. The official meaning and the deeper meaning can coexist. They are not mutually exclusive. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken, not because it is wrong, but because it may not be telling the whole story. Taken individually, each of these 3 details, the unconfirmed face, the quietly replaced torch, the multi-layered symbolism of the crown, can be addressed with a reasonable explanation. A sculptor's personal model is not always documented. Aging monuments require maintenance and restoration. Symbolic numbers have multiple associations across different traditions. None of these points, standing alone, constitute strong evidence of anything beyond the ordinary complexity of history. But this is precisely the point that some researchers have been making for years. The issue is not any single detail. The issue is the accumulation. When several elements of a monument share a similar quality, an absence of clear documentation here, an unexplained decision there, a symbolic choice that carries more layers than the official account acknowledges, the overall picture begins to feel less fully explained than it first appeared. And that feeling is not irrational. It is the natural response of someone paying careful attention. There is also something worth noting about the general approach to these details in the mainstream historical record. Questions about the face of the statue, the replacement of the torch, and the layered meaning of the crown have been raised before. They are not new observations. Researchers and writers have pointed them out at various points over the decades, and the response to those observations has generally been one of 2 kinds, either a brief, practical explanation followed by a return to the standard narrative, or simple silence. What has not happened, in any sustained or public way, is a thorough, transparent engagement with the questions themselves. That pattern, raise a question, receive a brief response, move on, is itself a kind of answer. Not a definitive one, but a suggestive one. It suggests that certain questions about this symbol are not considered worthy of extended public examination. And when questions about a national symbol are consistently treated as minor or irrelevant, it tends to produce exactly the kind of incomplete picture that careful investigators have spent years trying to fill in. Some believe the gaps in the official record are simply the natural result of historical distance, that records are lost, memories fade, and not every decision made in the 19th century was carefully documented for future scrutiny. That is a fair point. Historical incompleteness is real, and it is not always the result of deliberate concealment. Others disagree, arguing that the specific nature of the gaps, the absence of documentation precisely around the most symbolically significant elements of the monument, is not easily explained by simple historical accident. Neither position can be fully proven from the available evidence, and that in itself is part of what makes this investigation continue to matter. The Statue of Liberty is not just an old monument in a harbor. It is a living symbol that continues to be invoked in political speeches, immigration debates, and national identity discussions to this day. The meaning carried by that symbol, and the accuracy of the explanation attached to it, is not a purely academic question. It has real consequences for how people understand their country and its values. The surface explanation for each element of the statue is accurate as far as it goes. The face may well be Bartholdi's mother. The torch was replaced for legitimate conservation reasons. The 7 rays represent the seas and continents. These explanations are not invented, but accurate and complete are not the same thing. And the feeling shared by a growing number of researchers, that the surface is accurate but partial, that the full picture has never been clearly presented, does not go away simply because the official answers exist. What lies beneath the surface remains, for now, genuinely unclear, and that uncertainty, quiet and persistent, continues to sit beneath one of the world's most familiar symbols. When we begin to look more carefully at the people behind the Statue of Liberty, not just the idea of it, but the actual individuals who funded it, promoted it, and brought it into existence, something interesting starts to emerge. On the French side especially, there is a pattern worth examining, a pattern that does not explain itself easily, and that the official historical record tends to address only briefly before moving on. The central figure on the French side was Édouard de Laboulaye. He was a legal scholar, a political thinker, and a man deeply committed to the ideals of liberty and republican government. He is widely credited with proposing the original concept of gifting a monument to the United States, a symbol of shared values between France and America. His motivations, as they are most commonly described, were political and philosophical. He admired American democracy and wanted to celebrate it. That is the accepted explanation. But Laboulaye was not simply a political admirer of America. He was part of a specific circle, and that circle had a name. Laboulaye was a member of the French Freemasons. So were many of his closest associates. The men who gathered around him shared his ideas, supported his cause, and helped turn a dinner conversation into one of the most recognized monuments in the world. This is not a fringe claim or a detail buried in obscure sources. It is documented. It appears in historical records. It is not seriously disputed by mainstream historians. Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, the sculptor who designed the statue and gave it its final form, was also a Freemason. He was initiated into a lodge in Paris and remained connected to Masonic circles throughout his life. The man who physically shaped the figure, who decided how it would look, what it would hold, how it would stand, carried that membership with him throughout the entire project. And then there is the cornerstone. When the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty was being constructed in New York, a ceremony was held to mark the laying of its cornerstone. That ceremony was not a standard civic event. It was a Masonic ceremony, officiated by the Grand Master of the Masons of New York. Masonic ritual was performed. Masonic symbols were present. The moment that physically anchored the statue to American soil was conducted according to Masonic tradition. This is documented. It is not hidden. It is part of the historical record of the construction. And yet, when people discuss the Statue of Liberty, this detail is rarely part of the story. It does not appear in most school textbooks. It is not mentioned on most tourist plaques. It sits in the records, acknowledged but rarely examined. The official explanation for all of this is straightforward. Freemasonry, in the 19th century, was deeply embedded in intellectual and political life, particularly in France and in the United States. Many prominent thinkers, artists, politicians, and public figures were members. It was not unusual for a major public project of that era to involve Freemasons, simply because Freemasons were everywhere in positions of influence. Their involvement, according to this view, does not carry any particular meaning. It reflects the social landscape of the time. Nothing more. That explanation is reasonable. It is not without merit, and it may, in fact, be entirely correct. But this is where it becomes unclear. Freemasonry is not simply a social club or a network of influential people. It has a very specific symbolic language. It uses specific images, specific ideas, and specific visual representations that carry meaning within the tradition. These are not casual decorations. They are deliberate choices, and several of these symbols appear, repeatedly, in and around the Statue of Liberty and the broader iconography of the same period. The torch is one of them. The statue holds a torch raised above her head. In the official interpretation, the torch represents enlightenment, the light of freedom and knowledge spreading into the world. That is a clear and meaningful explanation. But the torch also holds a specific place in Masonic symbolism. It represents the transmission of light, of knowledge passed from one bearer to the next. The phrase most associated with the statue, "Liberty enlightening the world," uses the word enlightening in a way that functions perfectly within that symbolic framework. Whether that is coincidence or intention is not easy to determine. The all-seeing eye is another. It does not appear on the statue itself, but it appears on the reverse side of the American $1 bill, alongside an unfinished pyramid, another symbol with deep roots in Masonic iconography. The $1 bill in its current form was redesigned in the 1930s, not in the same era as the statue. But the symbols it uses, the eye, the pyramid, the Latin phrases surrounding them, draw from the same visual and philosophical tradition. These elements were chosen deliberately by people who understood their meaning. That much is not disputed. What remains less certain is precisely what meaning they intended to embed. The unfinished pyramid deserves a moment of attention on its own. In Masonic symbolism, the unfinished pyramid represents a project that is still in progress, a work that is moving toward completion but has not yet arrived. It is associated with ongoing human striving, with the idea that the work of building civilization, of building enlightenment, is never fully done. It is a symbol of process rather than arrival. When that image appears on a nation's currency, alongside an eye that sees all, it raises questions, not accusations, questions. Some researchers and historians argue that what we are looking at is a coherent symbolic program, that the people involved in creating the Statue of Liberty and in shaping certain aspects of American public symbolism were intentionally embedding a specific visual language into monuments and objects that would be seen by millions. That this language belonged to a tradition, Freemasonry, that valued the transmission of ideas through symbols, and that these individuals saw no reason to separate their private symbolic world from the public monuments they were helping to create. Others disagree. They argue that symbolic overlap is not the same as symbolic intent, that the torch, the eye, and the pyramid are ancient images that appear across many cultures and many traditions, not just Freemasonry, that finding these shapes in public art does not prove Masonic authorship any more than finding a circle proves geometric conspiracy. The argument is that people sometimes look for patterns, and when they look hard enough, they find them, whether or not the patterns were deliberately placed there. Both of these positions have something to recommend them, and neither one fully closes the question. What makes this particularly difficult to resolve is the nature of Masonic tradition itself. Freemasonry is not a secretive organization in the sense of hiding its existence. It has lodges, public records, and membership lists that historians can consult. But it does value the private transmission of certain ideas. Its rituals are not public. Its deeper symbolic meanings are reserved for members at particular levels of initiation. This creates a situation where the outer layer of Masonic activity is visible and documented, while the inner layer, what the symbols actually meant to the people using them, is far harder to access from the outside. That gap makes historical interpretation complicated. It means that even when we can confirm that a Masonic ceremony took place, or that a Freemason designed a particular symbol, We cannot always confirm what meaning that person attached to the act. We are working with documented surfaces and uncertain depths. What we are left with is a set of facts that sit together in an unusual way. The primary promoter of the statue was a Freemason. The sculptor was a Freemason. The cornerstone ceremony was Masonic. The statue holds a torch that carries meaning within Masonic tradition. And the broader symbolic landscape of the same era includes images, on currency, in architecture, in public art, that draw from the same tradition. Each of these facts, taken alone, can be explained. Taken together, they raise a question that does not have a clean answer. Was this symbolic language being used deliberately, consciously, and with specific intent? Or was it simply the visual vocabulary of an era, used naturally by people who happen to share certain memberships and certain aesthetic sensibilities? That question remains open, and it may remain open for a long time, not because the evidence is hidden, but because the evidence we have does not reach all the way to the interior of the decisions that were made. We can see what was built. We can see who built it. We can see what symbols were used. What we cannot always see is the precise conversation that happened between the people involved, the moment when a symbol was chosen, and what was said in that room when the choice was made. History often leaves us with exactly this kind of gap. The objects survive. The records survive. The intentions do not always come with them. And so the Statue of Liberty continues to stand in the harbor, torch raised, face turned outward, base laid in a Masonic ceremony, designed by a Freemason, championed by a man who moved in Masonic circles. Millions of people pass by it or look at photographs of it every year, most of them thinking of it simply as a symbol of freedom and welcome. That meaning is real. It is not diminished by these questions. But the questions themselves do not disappear either. They stay in the background, attached to the documented facts, waiting for an explanation that fully accounts for all of them at once. So far, that explanation has not arrived. There is a point in any investigation where individual pieces of evidence stop feeling separate, where you look at what you have gathered, one fact here, another there, a name that keeps appearing, a symbol that shows up more than once, and something shifts. The pieces begin to arrange themselves. A shape starts to form, and once that happens, it is difficult to look at each piece in isolation again. That is where this investigation now stands. We have already looked at the Statue of Liberty, at the Freemasons who promoted it, designed it, and laid its cornerstone in a Masonic ceremony. That alone could be set aside. It could be explained as the natural result of Freemasonry's widespread influence in the 19th century. One monument, one set of individuals, one era. Understandable. But the Statue of Liberty is not alone. When you step back and look at the broader landscape of American public symbolism, the monuments, the architecture, the currency, the layout of the capital city itself, the same names, the same affiliations, and the same symbolic vocabulary begin to appear again and again. And that repetition is what makes this worth examining more carefully. Start with the Washington Monument. It stands at the center of the National Mall in Washington, D.C., a tall, narrow obelisk rising from the ground, visible from most of the surrounding city. It is one of the most recognized structures in the United States. Its design is not accidental. The obelisk is an ancient form, originating in Egypt, and it carries a long history of symbolic meaning across many cultures and traditions. It also appears frequently in Masonic architecture and Masonic symbolism. The Washington Monument was not designed by a random committee with no symbolic awareness. The individuals involved in its planning and promotion were, again, connected to Freemasonry. The cornerstone laying ceremony, like that of the Statue of Liberty's pedestal, followed Masonic tradition. That is documented. It is in the historical record. At first, this sounds like the same story told twice, and perhaps it is. But there is a problem with leaving it there. When the same pattern appears across separate projects, separated by time and geography, involving different individuals who nonetheless share the same affiliation and the same symbolic tradition, the explanation of coincidence begins to require more work. Coincidence is a reasonable explanation for one occurrence. For two, it still holds. But as the number grows, the explanation has to stretch further each time to cover what is being observed. Consider the Capitol building. The construction and design of the United States Capitol involved multiple architects and went through several significant phases over many decades. What is less commonly discussed is the degree to which Freemasonry was woven into its founding. The original cornerstone of the Capitol was laid in 1793. George Washington himself presided over the ceremony, dressed in full Masonic regalia. The ritual that accompanied the laying of that stone followed Masonic tradition. Corn, wine, and oil were poured over the stone, following a ceremony that had deep roots in the Masonic ritual of the era. This is not interpretation. It is described in contemporary accounts and historical records of the event, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. George Washington was a Freemason. So was Benjamin Franklin. So was Paul Revere. So were a significant number of the Founding Fathers, not all of them, but enough that the question of Masonic influence on the founding of the United States is not a fringe topic. It is a legitimate historical discussion that serious scholars have engaged with for a long time. The disagreement is not about whether these men were Freemasons. That is established. The disagreement is about what their membership meant in practice, and whether it shaped the decisions they made about symbols, architecture, and the visual identity of the new nation. Then there's the layout of Washington, D.C. itself. This is where the claims become more contested and where careful attention is needed. Some researchers, and not only fringe theorists, but people who have spent considerable time with maps and historical documents, argue that the street layout of Washington, D.C. contains deliberate geometric patterns that align with Masonic principles. The most commonly cited example is a street pattern north of the White House that, when viewed from above, forms the rough shape of an inverted pentagram, with the White House sitting near one of its points. Similar geometric observations have been made about other sections of the city plan. The official response to these claims is that the city was designed by Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French engineer, and that the diagonal avenues he laid out were intended to create practical connections between key landmarks, not to encode symbolic geometry. L'Enfant's design, according to historians, followed the principles of Baroque urban planning rather than Masonic ritual. The geometric patterns that some people see in the map, this view holds, are the result of reading meaning into shapes that were created for purely practical reasons. That explanation is reasonable, and it may be correct, but there's a detail that does not fully disappear. L'Enfant was eventually dismissed from the project. The man who took over the surveying and much of the practical execution of the D.C. plan was Andrew Ellicott, and the individual who assisted in much of that work, who is credited in some historical accounts with significant contributions to the final layout, was Benjamin Banneker, a free black mathematician and surveyor of remarkable ability. What is less often mentioned is that the broader oversight of the Capitol's design and development involved individuals who were, again, connected to Masonic networks. Whether those connections influenced specific decisions about the city's geometry is something the historical record does not fully clarify. That gap matters, not because it proves anything, but because a pattern that keeps appearing across multiple major symbols, and that keeps involving the same network of people and the same symbolic tradition, deserves an explanation that accounts for all of it together, not just each piece separately. Some historians take a measured position on this. They argue that Freemasonry in the 18th and early 19th centuries was genuinely dominant among educated, politically engaged elites in both Europe and America. It was not simply a social club. It was a philosophical tradition that attracted people who were interested in ideas about reason, liberty, civic virtue, and the building of a new kind of society. The American founding, in particular, was a project driven by exactly those ideas. So it is not surprising, this argument goes, that the people most involved in building the physical symbols of that project were Freemasons. They were the people most committed to the project's ideals. Their symbolic vocabulary naturally appeared in the things they built. That is a coherent argument. It does not require conspiracy. It does not require secrecy or hidden agendas. It simply says that a group of people who shared a worldview also shared a symbolic language, and that language found its way into their public work because it was genuinely part of how they understood what they were doing. Others look at the same evidence and reach a different conclusion. They argue that the density of Masonic symbolism across American monuments, currency, and urban design is too consistent and too deliberate to be explained as casual cultural expression. They point to the specific choices made: the obelisk, the torch, the unfinished pyramid, the all-seeing eye, the geometric street layouts, and argue that these were not simply the aesthetic preferences of individuals who happened to be Freemasons. They were intentional acts of symbolic embedding, a deliberate effort by a specific group of people to inscribe their philosophical tradition into the physical foundations of a new nation. This second position is harder to prove. It requires demonstrating not just that the symbols are present, which is not disputed, but that they were placed there with conscious intent and with a shared understanding of their Masonic meaning. That kind of interior evidence, the conversations, the deliberate decisions, the explicit statements of intent, is much harder to find in the historical record. Some of it exists. Masonic publications from the era discuss the symbolic significance of certain monuments. Some letters and documents from founding fathers touch on these themes, but the full picture is not there. Enough is documented to raise the question. Not enough is documented to fully close it. And that is precisely the problem. In most historical investigations, the absence of evidence is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests the thing did not happen, or did not happen in the way being described. But in cases involving Masonic tradition specifically, the absence of explicit documentation is harder to interpret. Freemasonry, by its own design, does not commit all of its meaning to public record. Its rituals are private. Its symbolic interpretations are passed through initiation rather than written explanation. This means that even when we have full access to the outer record, the names, the ceremonies, the buildings, the symbols, we may still be missing the inner record, which is where the actual intent resided. That is not an accusation. It is simply an observation about the nature of the tradition we are examining. And it means that the question of intent, the most important question, may never be answerable from the outside. What we are left with is a landscape of documented facts that sit in an uncomfortable arrangement. The same affiliation appears across multiple major American symbols. The same symbolic vocabulary appears in the architecture, the currency, and the urban design of the nation's capital. The ceremonies that mark the physical founding of these symbols followed the same tradition, and the people involved, across different decades and different projects, were connected to one another through that tradition. None of this proves a coordinated secret program, but none of it is easily waved away either. The official explanations, that Freemasonry was simply influential, that the symbols reflect common aesthetic choices, that the geometry is coincidental, are individually reasonable. Together, they ask us to accept a very large number of coincidences occurring in the same direction, involving the same network, producing the same visual outcomes. A reasonable person can accept that. Many do. And a reasonable person can also look at the same set of facts and feel that something has not been fully explained, that the pattern is asking a question the official record has not yet fully answered. Both of those responses are, in their own way, justified. The evidence supports both. And that, more than anything else about this investigation, is what makes it so difficult to set aside. The questions that surround the Statue of Liberty do not stay neatly contained. They do not stop at the water's edge of New York Harbor or remain limited to debates about who designed the statue and what symbols they chose. Once you begin pulling on certain threads, the funding, the promotion, the people involved, the symbolic choices made, those threads connect to something larger, to questions that go beyond any single monument and reach into how nations construct meaning, how symbols acquire power, and who stands behind that process when the public is not fully in the room. These are not comfortable questions, but they are not irresponsible ones either. Historians, political scientists, and media researchers have explored versions of them for a long time. They are questions about how public belief is shaped, who shapes it, and what interests are served when a population becomes deeply emotionally attached to a particular image or idea. To begin with the most basic version of the question, who decides what a national symbol means? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. A symbol means what it is said to mean. The Statue of Liberty represents freedom, welcome, and the promise of a better life. That is what was announced at its dedication. That is what has been repeated in speeches, textbooks, newspapers, and political rhetoric for well over a century. The meaning feels settled. It feels natural. It feels as though it could not have been otherwise. But meanings are not born fully formed. They are constructed. They are repeated until they become fixed. And the process of constructing and repeating a meaning always involves specific people making specific choices about what to emphasize, what to leave out, and what story to tell about an object or a place. That process does not happen on its own. It requires voices. It requires platforms. And in the late 19th century, one of the most powerful platforms available was the newspaper press. This is where Joseph Pulitzer enters the story, and his entry is worth examining carefully. By the 1880s, the Statue of Liberty project was facing a serious problem. The statue itself, being built in France, was progressing, but in the United States, the effort to raise funds for the pedestal, the base on which the statue would stand, had stalled badly. Fundraising campaigns had not produced enough money. Wealthy donors had not stepped forward in the numbers needed. There was a real possibility that the statue would be completed but have nowhere to stand, with no base to support it on American soil. The project that was meant to represent the bond between France and the United States was at risk of failing on the American side. Joseph Pulitzer stepped in. He used his newspaper, the New York World, to launch a public fundraising campaign, one of the first of its kind in American media history. He appealed directly to ordinary citizens. He published the names of donors, even those who gave small amounts. He framed the pedestal not as a project for the wealthy elite, but as something that belonged to every American. The campaign worked. Enough money was raised. The pedestal was built. The statue was installed. At first, this sounds like a straightforward story of civic generosity and media leadership, and in many ways it was. But this is where it becomes unclear. What Pulitzer did was not simply raise money. He shaped the meaning of the statue in the process. Through his newspaper, he told Americans what the statue was, what it stood for, and why it mattered. He framed the emotional narrative around it. He decided which voices to amplify and which aspects of the statue's story to foreground. By the time the fundraising campaign was over, millions of Americans had not just contributed money. They had been given a story about what their contribution meant. They had been given a specific way of understanding the object they had just helped build. This raises a question that is easy to overlook. When a private media figure plays a central role in generating public enthusiasm for a national symbol, where exactly is the line between public monument and media-driven project? The Statue of Liberty was, in its final form, partly a product of editorial decisions made by a newspaper publisher. The emotional meaning it carried in the minds of ordinary Americans was shaped, at least in part, by the framing choices of a private press. That is not an accusation against Pulitzer. His campaign may have been entirely well-intentioned. The effect it had, bringing the statue into existence for the American public, was real and lasting. But the mechanism it used was a privately controlled information platform with its own interests, its own editorial perspective, and its own reasons for choosing to invest so heavily in this particular cause. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Pulitzer was not a disinterested party. He was building a newspaper empire in one of the most competitive media markets in the world. The New York World, under his direction, was engaged in a fierce circulation war with other major papers, most notably William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. The Statue of Liberty campaign brought enormous attention to the world. It raised the paper's profile. It positioned Pulitzer as a champion of the common American. The campaign served the statue, but it also served the newspaper. Both things can be true at the same time. And when both things are true at the same time, it becomes worth asking which one was the primary motivation. That question does not have a clean answer in the historical record. What it does have is a presence, a small but persistent uncertainty about the relationship between public symbolism and private interest that sits beneath the official story of how the statue was funded. Wider than the question of Pulitzer, though, is the question of who benefits from a population that holds deep emotional attachment to a particular symbol. This is a question that political scientists and historians have explored in different contexts and with different conclusions. The short answer is that symbols with strong public emotional investment are valuable. They can be used. They can be invoked in political arguments. They can be deployed to support or oppose specific policies. They carry a kind of preloaded authority that makes them powerful tools in public debate. The Statue of Liberty is a clear example of this. Almost from the moment of its dedication, It began to be used in arguments about immigration, about who was welcome in America and who was not. The famous lines written by Emma Lazarus about the tired, the poor, the huddled masses were not originally part of the statue's official design or dedication. They were added later, inscribed on a plaque inside the pedestal in 1903, more than 15 years after the statue was unveiled. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The most emotionally resonant words associated with the statue, the ones most often quoted in immigration debates, were not present at the beginning. They were attached afterward, becoming part of the official meaning over time, through a process that was itself a series of editorial choices made by specific people. Who made those choices, and what they understood about the power of those words in shaping public attitudes toward immigration, is a question worth sitting with. The Lazarus poem transformed the statue's meaning in a specific direction, toward an explicit message of welcome for the displaced and the struggling. That meaning has been used, ever since, by people on different sides of immigration debates. Some invoke it as a statement of national values that should shape policy. Others argue that a poem added to a pedestal decades after the fact does not constitute a binding national commitment. The debate continues, and at the center of it stands a symbol whose meaning was, at least in part, constructed after the fact. This connects to a broader point about how history is recorded and what gets left out. The official story of the Statue of Liberty is coherent, inspiring, and widely taught. It emphasizes the friendship between France and America, the ideals of liberty, the generosity of ordinary citizens who contributed to the pedestal fund, and the welcoming message to immigrants. That story is not false, but it is selective. It does not include the Masonic ceremonies. It does not foreground the philosophical societies involved in the statue's promotion. It does not examine the media dynamics of Pulitzer's campaign in depth. It does not ask who controlled the framing of the statue's meaning from the beginning. Selective history is not the same as dishonest history. Every historical account makes choices about what to include and what to set aside. The question is whether the things being left out are genuinely irrelevant, details that do not change the essential picture, or whether they are details that would complicate the picture in ways that are inconvenient for the official narrative. That question applies to the Statue of Liberty as much as it applies to anything else, and the answer is not obvious. As the statue's symbolic reach has grown over the decades, as it has been invoked in immigration policy debates, used in political advertising, reproduced on merchandise, referenced in international diplomacy, and made into one of the most recognizable images in global culture, the stakes attached to its meaning have grown alongside it. The statue is no longer simply a monument in a harbor. It is a globally legible symbol of what America claims to represent, how that symbol is interpreted, who controls that interpretation, and what history is or is not attached to it in the public mind. These are not academic questions. They have practical consequences for real policy debates and real lives. And yet the process by which that meaning was established, the decisions made in the 1870s and 1880s about how to frame the statue, what story to tell about it, whose voices to amplify and whose to ignore, is not a process that most people ever examine. It happened in newspaper offices and private correspondence and public ceremonies. It happened in rooms that are no longer accessible. It produced a meaning that now feels so natural, so fixed, so obviously correct, that the process itself has become invisible. That invisibility is perhaps the most interesting thing about the entire story. Not the Masonic symbols, not the funding questions, not the delayed inscription, but the simple fact that a meaning was constructed, deliberately, by specific people with specific interests, and that construction was so successful that it no longer looks like a construction at all. It looks like truth. It looks like the obvious, natural, self-evident meaning of a woman standing in a harbor holding a torch. And maybe it is. Maybe the meaning that was constructed is also genuinely true, an accurate reflection of something real about the ideals behind the project. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. A meaning can be deliberately shaped and also genuinely reflect something important. That possibility is real, and it should not be dismissed. But the fact that a meaning was shaped, that it did not simply emerge on its own, that choices were made, that some things were emphasized and others were not, that fact does not disappear just because the result was convincing. It stays in the background, attached to the record, waiting for anyone who looks carefully enough to notice it. Over the course of this investigation, a number of questions have been raised that the official explanation does not fully resolve. The Masonic connections, the symbolic vocabulary embedded in the statue and its surroundings, the role of private media in shaping public meaning, the selective nature of the historical record. Each of these points toward something that sits just outside the boundary of the standard story. Not a single alternative answer, but a set of alternative ways of looking at what the statue is, what it was intended to be, and what it has become. Several of these alternative interpretations have been proposed and explored over the years by researchers working in different fields: history, political theory, art history, cultural studies. None of them are universally accepted. None of them have replaced the official explanation in mainstream discourse. But they represent serious thinking about a subject that the official account has never fully closed. And they deserve to be examined on their own terms, clearly and without exaggeration. The first interpretation begins with the Masonic and Rosicrucian traditions that were present amongst several of the statue's key figures. It does not stop at simply noting that Freemasons were involved. It goes further and argues that the statue was designed, from the beginning, as a monument to a specific philosophical idea, one that belongs to a particular tradition of esoteric thought rather than to the general public idea of political freedom. In this reading, the central concept is illumination. Not illumination in the everyday sense of lighting something up, but illumination as it is understood within certain philosophical and initiatory traditions, the transmission of hidden knowledge, the awakening of deeper understanding, the idea that a select group of individuals possesses a form of wisdom that is not available to everyone. In this tradition, light is not just a physical phenomenon. It is a symbol of something kept, guarded, and passed from one initiated person to the next. The torch, seen through this lens, takes on a different character. It is not a torch held out to the world as a gift, inviting everyone to share in its warmth. It is a torch held upward by someone who possesses what others do not. The light belongs to the holder. The name of the statue, Liberty Enlightening the World, carries a very different weight in this interpretation. Who is doing the enlightening? Who decided they had the right to enlighten? And what exactly is the knowledge being offered, and to whom? This interpretation does not require that the statue's designers had sinister intentions. It simply suggests that the symbolic language they used carried meanings within their own tradition that were not the same as the meanings broadcast to the general public. Two layers of meaning existing at the same time, one for the broad audience, one for the initiated. That kind of double meaning is not unusual in the history of public art and architecture. It has been documented in other contexts. Whether it applies here is something the available record does not conclusively confirm or deny. The Rosicrucian tradition, which overlaps in certain ways with Freemasonry, placed particular emphasis on the idea of hidden knowledge held by a philosophical brotherhood, knowledge that was considered too important or too dangerous to be made fully public. Several figures associated with the broader intellectual circle around the statue's creation had connections to this tradition as well. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is placed alongside the other symbolic choices that have already been documented. Then it begins to fit a pattern that is harder to dismiss without explanation. The second interpretation is less concerned with esoteric symbolism and more focused on political strategy. It approaches the statue as an instrument of soft power, a carefully designed tool for shaping political perception across international borders during a period of significant instability in both France and the United States. In France, the 1870s were a turbulent decade. The country had suffered a catastrophic military defeat against Prussia. The Paris Commune had shaken the political establishment. The question of what form French government should take, republic, monarchy, or something else, was genuinely unresolved. French Republicans, including Laboulaye and his circle, were fighting for their vision of a liberal, democratic France against powerful monarchist opposition. In that context, the gift of a statue to America was not simply a gesture of friendship. It was a political statement, a way of saying, publicly, visibly, in the form of a monument that could not be ignored, that republicanism was the correct path, that liberty was the future, that France should follow America's example, not turned back toward monarchy. This raises questions about who the statue was really for. The official story presents it as a gift from France to America, but in this interpretation, it functioned at least as much as a message from French Republicans to French audiences. A monument placed across the Atlantic, visible in the harbor of the world's most successful republic, was a powerful argument in a domestic French political debate. That the statue was described as a gift to America does not mean it was not also a tool in French internal politics. Both things could have been true at the same time. On the American side, the soft power argument takes a slightly different form. The statue arrived at a moment when American identity was still being actively constructed in the aftermath of the Civil War. The question of what America stood for, what its core values were, what kind of nation it intended to be, was far from settled. A monument celebrating liberty, funded through a public campaign that made ordinary citizens feel ownership over it, served to consolidate a particular answer to that question. It helped define, or reinforce, a specific version of American identity at a moment when that identity was contested and uncertain. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the statue functioned as a tool for shaping political identity on both sides of the Atlantic, then the question of who controlled that tool, and in whose interest it was deployed, becomes more significant than the official story allows for. The third interpretation is more critical in its focus, and it approaches the statue from a different angle entirely. It does not primarily ask about Masonic symbolism or political strategy. It asks about exclusion, about the gap between the statue's stated meaning and the reality experienced by the people most in need of what it claimed to represent. The statue was unveiled in 1886. At that time, the majority of Black Americans, freed from slavery only 2 decades earlier, were living under conditions of systematic legal discrimination, economic deprivation, and racial violence. Women in the United States did not have the right to vote. The immigrant poor who arrived through New York Harbor were often processed under harsh conditions and subjected to suspicion and restriction rather than the warm welcome the statue's symbolism seemed to promise. And yet the figure chosen to represent liberty was a robed woman holding a torch, an idealized image with no particular connection to the actual human beings for whom liberty remained an unfulfilled promise. This gap was noticed at the time. Frederick Douglass, one of the most prominent Black American voices of the era, was largely absent from the dedication ceremony. The event itself was attended almost entirely by white men. Women were not permitted to participate in the official proceedings. A group of women protested from boats in the harbor, unable to get closer. That detail sits in the historical record quietly, rarely mentioned in standard accounts of the statue's unveiling. The critical interpretation argues that this exclusion was not accidental, that the symbolism of freedom was deliberately placed in a public, highly visible form precisely at a moment when the actual extension of freedom to excluded groups was being resisted. In this reading, the statue did not represent a promise being made. It represented an image being projected, an image of liberty that served the self-presentation of the powerful, while the real work of extending liberty remained undone. Some historians find this interpretation too strong. They argue that public symbols routinely exceed the circumstances of their creation, that a monument can represent an aspiration that its makers did not fully live up to, and that the failure to live up to an ideal does not make the ideal itself hollow. On this view, the statue can genuinely represent liberty even if the people who built it were imperfect in their commitment to it. Others find that response insufficient. They argue that the gap between the symbol and the reality was not a matter of imperfection, but of active contradiction, that the same political establishment that erected a monument to liberty was simultaneously working to suppress the liberty of specific populations, and that understanding the statue fully requires holding both of those things in view at the same time, not allowing the beauty of the symbol to obscure the reality of what was happening in its shadow. Both positions reflect genuine historical thinking. Neither is without basis, and the tension between them does not resolve neatly. It sits in the middle of any serious examination of what the statue is and what it has meant to different people across different periods. What is notable about all three of these interpretations, the esoteric symbolism reading, the soft power reading, and the critical exclusion reading, is that none of them require the official explanation to be false. They do not claim that the statue was not a gift, or that liberty was not a genuine value for at least some of its creators, or that the public meaning it acquired was entirely manufactured. What they argue in different ways is that the official explanation is incomplete, that it captures one layer of what the statue is while leaving other layers unexamined. And those unexamined layers are not trivial. They concern who held power over the statue's meaning, what philosophical tradition shaped its symbolic design, what political work it was doing in the world beyond its stated purpose, and who was excluded from the freedom it claimed to represent. These are not minor footnotes. They are central questions about a symbol that continues to be invoked regularly in political life. Some believe the truth lies somewhere between the official explanation and one or more of these alternatives, that a full account of the statue would need to incorporate elements of all of them to be genuinely complete. Others maintain that the official explanation is sufficient, that the alternatives are speculative, and that the statue's public meaning is its real meaning regardless of whatever else may have surrounded its creation. Both of those positions are held by thoughtful people. Neither fully satisfies all of the evidence, and neither closes the questions that this investigation has been tracing from the beginning. Questions that the statue itself, standing in the harbor with its torch raised and its face turned outward, does not answer. It simply stands, letting each generation decide for itself what it is looking at, and what it means, and whether the light it holds is really meant for them. We have come a long way from the surface of the statue, from the copper skin and the raised torch and the harbor view that millions of tourists photograph each year, from the clean, familiar version of the story, the French gift, the symbol of freedom, the welcome to the world's displaced and struggling. That version of the story is still there. It has not been disproven. It has not been replaced. But alongside it, running underneath it and around it, is a set of questions that this investigation has been carefully tracing. And those questions do not simply close themselves because the official account is well established and widely believed. So where does this leave us? That is the honest question to ask at this point. Not what is the final answer, not what is the hidden truth, but simply, after everything that has been examined, what are we actually left with? We are left with a monument that is still standing. The torch still rises. The face still looks outward. The harbor is still there. None of that has changed. And for the millions of people who look at the statue, whether from a ferry, or a photograph, or a textbook page, the meaning it carries is real. It is not false simply because it was constructed. It is not hollow simply because the people who built it had complicated histories and unspoken intentions. The emotional truth that ordinary people have found in that image over more than a century is genuine. That needs to be said clearly, and it needs to stay said. But the questions remain. And they are specific questions, not vague suspicions or general unease, but particular, documented points that the official story has never fully addressed. The first is the design origin. Bartholdi originally conceived a version of this figure for Egypt, a robed woman holding a torch at the entrance to the Suez Canal. That project did not proceed. The design was later adapted and proposed for the United States. The official explanation is that Bartholdi simply reworked an unused concept and found it a new purpose. That is possible. Artists reuse ideas. Concepts evolve. But the question of what it means that the figure now standing in New York Harbor was first imagined for a completely different country, a different continent, and a different context, that question has never been given a fully satisfying answer. The design carried meaning in its original conception. What happened to that meaning when it was transferred? Was it left behind? Or did it travel with the figure? The second unresolved point is the Masonic involvement. This has been examined in some detail across earlier parts of this investigation. The connections are documented. Laboulaye was a Freemason. Bartholdi was a Freemason. The cornerstone ceremony followed Masonic ritual. These are not disputed facts, and yet they appear in very few standard accounts of the statue's history. They are not featured in the visitor information at the monument. They are not part of the story most people are taught. Why not? If the involvement of Freemasons is genuinely insignificant, if it truly reflects nothing more than the social landscape of the era, then why does it so consistently fail to make it into the public-facing version of the history? That question does not have a satisfying answer in the available record. The absence of that information from mainstream accounts is itself a kind of information. It tells us that someone, at some point, decided this detail was not part of a story worth telling. That decision may have been made for entirely innocent reasons, a judgment that the Masonic connections were simply not relevant to the statue's public meaning. But it is still a decision, and decisions about what to include and what to leave out of a historical account are never entirely neutral. Then there is the third question, the one that is perhaps the most uncomfortable to sit with. The statue was unveiled in 1886. It claimed, through its name and its image, to represent liberty. And yet the America of 1886 was not extending liberty equally. Black Americans were living under the systematic dismantling of the post-Civil War Reconstruction gains. Legal segregation was being constructed and enforced across the South. The women who tried to attend the dedication ceremony were turned away from the official proceedings. The immigrant poor arriving through New York Harbor were being processed under conditions that bore little resemblance to the warmth of the statue's symbolic promise. At first, this seems like a familiar criticism, the gap between an ideal and the reality of its time. That gap exists in almost every historical moment, and most public symbols of aspiration are created in circumstances that do not fully live up to what the symbol claims. That is the nature of ideals. They reach beyond what currently exists. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the gap in 1886 was not simply a matter of aspiration running ahead of reality. Active, deliberate political work was being done, in the same years, by the same political establishment, to suppress the liberty of specific populations. The same government that accepted the statue as a symbol of freedom was simultaneously failing to enforce the rights of formerly enslaved people and allowing racial violence to go largely unchecked. That is not a gap between ideal and reality. That is a contradiction, and a symbol placed in the middle of that contradiction, presented publicly as a monument to liberty, raises questions about what the symbol was actually doing in that moment, and for whose benefit it was doing it. Some researchers have argued that the statue, in that specific historical context, functioned primarily as a symbol of liberty for a particular group, white, propertied, politically enfranchised Americans, while being presented in language broad enough to appear universal. The universality of the language was part of its function. It allowed the symbol to claim a meaning that was not yet, and in some respects was actively being prevented from becoming, a reality for everyone. That interpretation is contested. Others argue it asks too much of a monument, that a symbol cannot be held responsible for the full political context in which it exists, and that the statue's ideals, imperfectly realized as they were, still represented a genuine aspiration that later generations could and did build upon. Both of these positions reflect honest engagement with the evidence. Neither one is simply wrong, and that is, perhaps, the clearest way to describe where this investigation has arrived, not at an answer, but at a set of genuinely unresolved tensions between the official story and the documented record, between the statue's stated meaning and the context of its creation, between the symbol as most people experience it and the symbol as it looks when examined from the outside. The full story, whatever it actually is, has not been completely told. That is not a dramatic claim. It is simply accurate. The historical record contains gaps. It contains decisions about what to include and what to omit. It contains connections that are documented but rarely foreground, and questions that are raised by the evidence but never fully answered by it. None of this means the statue is something sinister. None of this means the official explanation is a lie. Those would be stronger claims than the evidence supports, and this investigation has tried throughout to stay within the boundaries of what the evidence actually shows. What the evidence shows is more modest, but in its own way more interesting. A monument that carries more layers than most people are taught to look for. A symbol whose meaning was shaped by specific people, with specific affiliations, working in a specific political and philosophical context, for reasons that were not always made fully public. When most people look at the Statue of Liberty, they see what they have been taught to see, and what they have been taught to see is not false. The image of welcome, of freedom, of a torch held up against the darkness, genuinely resonates with real human experience. People who arrived in New York Harbor after long and difficult journeys and saw that figure standing in the water. Their response was real. Their hope was real. The meaning they found in that image was real. No investigation into the statue's origins changes that. No set of questions about Masonic ceremonies or design origins or political context erases the genuine emotional weight that the statue has carried for real people across real generations. But two things can be true at once. A symbol can carry genuine meaning for the people who receive it, and also carry other meanings, layered underneath, built into its design, embedded by the people who created it, that those same people were never told about. That possibility is not unique to the Statue of Liberty. It applies to most major public symbols in most societies. The full meaning of a monument is rarely identical to the official meaning. There's almost always more context, more intention, more history than what appears on the plaque. In this case, the additional layers are documented. They are in the historical record. They are not the product of imagination or speculation, but of careful attention to sources that exist and can be consulted. What those layers mean, what they tell us about the true nature of the statue and the intentions of its creators, is something that remains open. It is something that different researchers, approaching the same evidence, have interpreted in different ways. And it is something that is unlikely to be fully resolved because the interior intentions of the people involved, what they actually meant, what they actually intended, what they actually understood about what they were building, are not fully accessible from where we stand now, looking back across more than a century. What remains is the monument itself, standing in the harbor, torch raised, the record sitting in archives, some consulted often, some rarely opened. The questions this investigation has traced still present, still unanswered, still attached to the documented facts like shadows that do not go away when the light shifts. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said at the end of all of this is simply that the story is not finished. Not because new evidence is certain to emerge, not because a final revelation is waiting somewhere to be found, but because the questions themselves are genuine, rooted in real history, supported by real documentation. And genuine questions do not disappear simply because the official account has stopped asking them. They stay, they wait, and they continue to ask quietly whether the full story of what stands in that harbor has ever really been told. Ritual. These are not disputed facts, and yet they appear in very few standard accounts of the statue's history. They are not featured in the visitor information at the monument. They are not part of the story most people are taught. Why not? If the involvement of Freemasons is genuinely insignificant, if it truly reflects nothing more than the social landscape of the era, then why does it so consistently fail to make it into the public-facing version of the history? That question does not have a satisfying answer in the available record. The absence of that information from mainstream accounts is itself a kind of information. It tells us that someone, at some point, decided this detail was not part of the story worth telling. That decision may have been made for entirely innocent reasons, a judgment that the Masonic connections were simply not relevant to the statue's public meaning. But it is still a decision, and decisions about what to include and what to leave out of a historical account are never entirely neutral. Then there's the third question, the one that is perhaps the most uncomfortable to sit with. The statue was unveiled in 1886. It claimed, through its name and its image, to represent liberty, and yet the America of 1886 was not extending liberty equally. Black Americans were living under the systematic dismantling of the post-Civil War Reconstruction gains. Legal segregation was being constructed and enforced across the South. The women who tried to attend the dedication ceremony were turned away from the official proceedings. The immigrant poor arriving through New York Harbor were being processed under conditions that bore little resemblance to the warmth of the statue's symbolic promise. At first, this seems like a familiar criticism. The gap between an ideal and the reality of its time. That gap exists in almost every historical moment, and most public symbols of aspiration are created in circumstances that do not fully live up to what the symbol claims. That is the nature of ideals. They reach beyond what currently exists. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the gap in 1886 was not simply a matter of aspiration running ahead of reality. Active, deliberate political work was being done in the same years, by the same political establishment, to suppress the liberty of specific populations. The The same government that accepted the statue as a symbol of freedom was simultaneously failing to enforce the rights of formerly enslaved people and allowing racial violence to go largely unchecked. That is not a gap between ideal and reality. That is a contradiction. And a symbol placed in the middle of that contradiction, presented publicly as a monument to liberty, raises questions about what the symbol was actually doing in that moment, and for whose benefit it was doing it. Some researchers have argued that the statue, in that specific historical context, functioned primarily as a symbol of liberty for a particular group, white, propertied, politically enfranchised Americans, while being presented in language broad enough to appear universal. The universality of the language was part of its function. It allowed the symbol to claim a meaning that was not yet, and in some respects was actively being prevented from becoming, a reality for everyone. That interpretation is contested. Others argue it asks too much of a monument, that a symbol cannot be held responsible for the full political context in which it exists, and that the statue's ideals, imperfectly realized as they were, still represented a genuine aspiration that later generations could and did build upon. Both of these positions reflect honest engagement with the evidence. Neither one is simply wrong, and that is, perhaps, the clearest way to describe where this investigation has arrived. Not an answer, but at a set of genuinely unresolved tensions between the official story and the documented record, between the statue's stated meaning and the context of its creation, between the symbol as most people experience it and the symbol as it looks when examined from the outside. The full story, whatever it actually is, has not been completely told. That is not a dramatic claim. It is simply accurate. The historical record contains gaps. It contains decisions about what to include and what to omit. It contains connections that are documented but rarely foreground, and questions that are raised by the evidence but never fully answered by it. On the American side, the soft power argument takes a slightly different form. The statue arrived at a moment when American identity was still being actively constructed in the aftermath of the Civil War. The question of what America stood for, what its core values were, what kind of nation it intended to be, was far from settled. A monument celebrating liberty, funded through a public campaign that made ordinary citizens feel ownership over it, served to consolidate a particular answer to that question. It helped define, or reinforce, a specific version of American identity at a moment when that identity was contested and uncertain. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the statue functioned as a tool for shaping political identity, on both sides of the Atlantic, then the question of who controlled that tool, and in whose interest it was deployed, becomes more significant than the official story allows for. The third interpretation is more critical in its focus, and it approaches the statue from a different angle entirely. It does not primarily ask about Masonic symbolism or political strategy. It asks about exclusion, about the gap between the statue's stated meaning and the reality experienced by the people most in need of what it claimed to represent. The statue was unveiled in 1886. At that time, the majority of Black Americans, freed from slavery only 2 decades earlier, were living under conditions of systematic legal discrimination, economic deprivation, and racial violence. Women in the United States did not have the right to vote. The immigrant poor who arrived through New York Harbor were often processed under harsh conditions and subjected to suspicion and restriction rather than the warm welcome the statue's symbolism seemed to promise. And yet the figure chosen to represent liberty was a robed woman holding a torch, an idealized image with no particular connection to the actual human beings for whom liberty remained an unfulfilled promise. This gap was noticed at the time. Frederick Douglass, one of the most prominent Black American voices of the era, was largely absent from the dedication ceremony. The event itself was attended almost entirely by white men. Women were not permitted to participate in the official proceedings. A group of women protested from boats in the harbor, unable to get closer. That detail sits in the historical record quietly, rarely mentioned in standard accounts of the statue's unveiling. The critical interpretation argues that this exclusion was not accidental, that the symbolism of freedom was deliberately placed in a public, highly visible form precisely at a moment when the actual extension of freedom to excluded groups was being resisted. In this reading, the statue did not represent a promise being made. It represented an image being projected, an image of liberty that served the self-presentation of the powerful, while the real work of extending liberty remained undone. Some historians find this interpretation too strong. They argue that public symbols routinely exceed the circumstances of their creation, that a monument can represent an aspiration that its makers did not fully live up to, and that the failure to live up to an ideal does not make the ideal itself hollow. On this view, the statue can genuinely represent liberty even if the people who built it were imperfect in their commitment to it. Others find that response insufficient. They argue that the gap between the symbol and the reality was not a matter of imperfection, but of active contradiction, that the same political establishment that erected a monument to liberty was simultaneously working to suppress the liberty of specific populations, and that understanding the statue fully requires holding both of those things in view at the same time, not allowing the beauty of the symbol to obscure the reality of what was happening in its shadow. Both positions reflect genuine historical thinking. Neither is without basis, and the tension between them does not resolve neatly. It sits in the middle of any serious examination of what the statue is and what it has meant to different people across different periods. What is notable about all three of these interpretations, the esoteric symbolism reading, the soft power reading, and the critical exclusion reading, is that none of them require the official explanation to be false. They do not claim that the statue was not a gift, or that liberty was not a genuine value for at least some of its creators, or that the public meaning it acquired was entirely manufactured. What they argue in different ways is that the official explanation is incomplete, that it captures one layer of what the statue is while leaving other layers unexamined. And those unexamined layers are not trivial. They concern who held power over the statue's meaning, what philosophical tradition shaped its symbolic design, what political work it was doing in the world beyond its stated purpose, and who was excluded from the freedom it claimed to represent. These are not minor footnotes. They are central questions about a symbol that continues to be invoked regularly in political life. Some believe the truth lies somewhere between the official explanation and one or more of these alternatives, that a full account of the statue would need to incorporate elements of all of them to be genuinely complete. Others maintain that the official explanation is sufficient, that the alternatives are speculative, and that the statue's public meaning is its real meaning regardless of whatever else may have surrounded its creation. Both of those positions are held by thoughtful people. Neither fully satisfies all of the evidence, and neither closes the questions that this investigation has been tracing from the beginning. Questions that the statue itself, standing in the harbor with its torch raised and its face turned outward, does not answer. It simply stands, letting each generation decide for itself what it is looking at, and what it means, and whether the light it holds is really meant for them. We have come a long way from the surface of the statue, from the copper skin and the raised torch and the harbor view that millions of tourists photograph each year, from the clean, familiar version of the story, the French gift, the symbol of freedom, the welcome to the world's displaced and struggling. That version of the story is still there. It has not been disproven. It has not been replaced. But alongside it, running underneath it and around it, is a set of questions that this investigation has been carefully tracing. And those questions do not simply close themselves because the official account is well established and widely believed. So where does this leave us? That is the honest question to ask at this point. Not what is the final answer, not what is the hidden truth, but simply, after everything that has been examined, what are we actually left with? We are left with a monument that is still standing. The torch still rises. The face still looks outward. The harbor is still there. None of that has changed. And for the millions of people who look at the statue, whether from a ferry or a photograph or a textbook page, the meaning it carries is real. It is not false simply because it was constructed. It is not hollow simply because the people who built it had complicated histories and unspoken intentions. The emotional truth that ordinary people have found in that image over more than a century is genuine. That needs to be said clearly, and it needs to stay said. But the questions remain. And they are specific questions, not vague suspicions or general unease, but particular, documented points that the official story has never fully addressed. The first is the design origin. Bartholdi originally conceived a version of this figure for Egypt, a robed woman holding a torch at the entrance to the Suez Canal. That project did not proceed. The design was later adapted and proposed for the United States. The official explanation is that Bartholdi simply reworked an unused concept and found it a new purpose. That is possible. Artists reuse ideas. Concepts evolve. But the question of what it means that the figure now standing in New York Harbor was first imagined for a completely different country, a different continent, and a different context, that question has never been given a fully satisfying answer. The design carried meaning in its original conception. What happened to that meaning when it was transferred? Was it left behind? Or did it travel with the figure? The second unresolved point is the Masonic involvement. This has been examined in some detail across earlier parts of this investigation. The connections are documented. Laboulaye was a Freemason. Bartholdi was a Freemason. The cornerstone ceremony followed Masonic.